The airport employee looked at the elderly black woman's passport, then slowly pushed it back across the counter like it disgusted her. "You need to step aside," she said loudly enough for nearby travelers to hear. But less than 20 minutes later, TSA agents would lock down part of the terminal after discovering something hidden in the airline's system. Before we begin, comment your city and what time it is right now, because this story starts with humiliation in front of an entire airport gate. But what happens next exposes something much bigger than one rude employee. It was one of the busiest travel weekends of the year. Flights delayed, passengers frustrated, security lines packed. And when an elderly black woman quietly approached the gate holding her boarding pass with trembling hands, nobody imagined the entire terminal would soon fall silent, watching airline staff panic in real time. The airport terminal pulsed with noise and movement beneath rows of bright overhead lights reflecting across polished floors. Travelers rushed between gates, dragging rolling suitcases behind them, while delayed flight announcements echoed constantly through crowded waiting areas. Children cried near vending machines. Business travelers argued quietly on phones. TSA agents moved through the terminal, scanning crowds with tired expressions after hours of non-stop work. Near Gate 32, passengers had already started gathering for a delayed evening flight to Atlanta. Some sat impatiently charging phones, while others crowded around the boarding desk demanding updates from exhausted airline employees. Tension already hung heavily in the air before the elderly woman even arrived. She moved slowly through the terminal, carrying a small navy blue handbag against her chest while carefully pulling an old rolling suitcase behind her. She looked somewhere in her 70s now, dressed simply in a long dark coat and soft gray scarf wrapped neatly around her shoulders.
Her movements were slow but dignified despite the visible exhaustion in her face. Every few seconds, she glanced carefully at her boarding pass, as though afraid she might accidentally walk to the wrong gate. Most passengers barely noticed her. To them, she looked like another tired old traveler struggling through a busy airport alone. But near the boarding counter, one airline employee noticed her immediately. Her name tag read, Gloria Matthews, late 40s, sharp makeup, tight smile. The kind of employee who judged people before speaking to them. Gloria stood behind the counter, processing upgrades for premium passengers, while speaking with fake politeness that disappeared the second difficult travelers approached. The moment her eyes landed on the elderly black woman slowly joining the boarding line, her expression changed slightly. Not dramatically, just enough for nearby employees to notice. The old woman finally reached the counter after waiting quietly, while impatient passengers behind her sighed and checked their watches. She carefully handed over her boarding pass and passport with polite, trembling hands. "Good evening," she said softly. Gloria glanced down at the documents for less than 2 seconds before her face tightened immediately. Then she looked back up at the elderly woman with cold suspicion already visible in her eyes. Gloria slowly typed something into the airline system while staring at the monitor with narrowed eyes. The elderly woman waited quietly at the counter, hands folded gently over the handle of her suitcase, while nearby passengers shifted impatiently behind her. After several long seconds, Gloria looked back up again. "Where did you get this boarding pass?" she asked sharply. The elderly woman blinked in confusion. "Excuse me?" Gloria tapped the keyboard again, harder this time. "This ticket," she repeated loudly.
"Where did you get it?" Several nearby travelers immediately turned their attention toward the counter after hearing the change in Gloria's tone. The old woman looked down at the boarding pass briefly before answering softly, "My grandson booked the flight for me." Gloria exchanged a quick glance with another employee beside her. Then she gave a small, sarcastic laugh under her breath. "Of course he did." The sentence landed heavily in the growing silence around the gate area. The elderly woman looked confused now. Is there a problem? Gloria slowly pushed the passport back across the counter, using only 2 fingers. This ticket is showing irregularities. Nearby passengers openly listened now, while the atmosphere around the gate became noticeably uncomfortable. One businessman lowered his phone slightly, while a younger woman near the boarding line quietly stopped walking altogether. The elderly woman's face tightened with worry. Irregularities? She repeated softly. Gloria leaned back in her chair. We've had issues recently involving fraudulent bookings. The old woman immediately shook her head. No, there must be some mistake. Gloria's expression hardened further. Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step aside while we verify some information. The humiliation became public instantly. Nearby passengers began whispering quietly, while several people glanced suspiciously toward the elderly woman standing alone beside the counter. The old woman looked around nervously now, visibly aware everyone was watching her. I don't understand, she whispered softly. My grandson paid for the ticket. Gloria crossed her arms. Then, if everything is legitimate, you have nothing to worry about. But her tone suggested the exact opposite. The elderly woman slowly stepped away from the boarding line exactly where Gloria instructed her to stand, beside a metal support column near the gate seating area where everyone could see her.
Passengers openly stared now, while whispers spread quietly between rows of waiting travelers. Some people looked uncomfortable. Others looked suspicious. And worst of all, nobody stepped in to help. Gloria continued working behind the counter like nothing unusual was happening, while occasionally glancing toward the elderly woman with visible irritation. Every few minutes, she typed something into the computer before whispering quietly to another airline employee nearby. The old woman stood silently beside her suitcase, clutching the strap of her handbag tighter and tighter, while confusion slowly turned into humiliation across her face. Finally, after several painful minutes, she carefully approached the counter again. Excuse me, she asked softly. Can someone explain what's happening? Gloria immediately looked annoyed. Ma'am, I already told you to wait. Several passengers nearby looked up again after hearing the sharpness in her voice. The old woman lowered her eyes briefly. I'm just worried I may miss the flight. Gloria let out a short laugh under her breath. At this point, boarding is the least of your problems. The sentence hit like a slap. Nearby passengers visibly reacted, while the old woman looked completely stunned by the cruelty in Gloria's tone. One younger traveler quietly muttered, "Damn," under his breath, while another woman near the charging station shook her head uncomfortably. But still, nobody intervened. The elderly woman slowly looked down at the boarding pass, still trembling slightly in her hands. I've never had trouble flying before, she whispered softly. Gloria shrugged. There's a first time for everything. The humiliation hung heavily across the gate area now. People were no longer simply overhearing the situation. They were watching it unfold like public entertainment. And standing there beneath the bright airport lights, while strangers stared at her from every direction, the elderly woman looked painfully alone. But what Gloria didn't realize was that several TSA officers standing farther down the terminal had already started paying attention to the situation too. One TSA officer near the security checkpoint quietly spoke into his radio while glancing toward Gate 32. Something about the situation felt wrong now. Not because of the elderly woman, but because of how aggressively the airline employee kept escalating the confrontation publicly. Meanwhile, Gloria continued speaking louder and louder every time the woman approached the counter, almost like she wanted nearby passengers to hear the accusations. Ma'am, Gloria said sharply after the old woman stepped forward again. If this booking is connected to fraud,
Federal authorities may need to become involved." Gasps spread quietly through the waiting area. The old woman's face immediately lost color. "Fraud?" she whispered. "No, there must be some mistake." Gloria gave a cold, professional smile. "Then you shouldn't be nervous." The sentence made several nearby travelers visibly uncomfortable now. Even another airline employee standing beside Gloria looked uneasy, hearing the way she spoke to the elderly woman. The old woman slowly lowered herself into a chair near the gate, while tightly holding her boarding pass against her chest, like she was afraid someone might take it away completely. Around her, passengers whispered quietly, while pretending not to stare openly. One older man seated nearby finally muttered under his breath, "This feels wrong." But before anyone else could respond, 2 TSA officers suddenly approached the counter. The atmosphere around the gate shifted instantly. Gloria immediately straightened her posture with sudden confidence after seeing federal officers arrive. "Officers," she said quickly, pointing toward the elderly woman. "This passenger may be connected to fraudulent travel documentation." The elderly woman looked terrified now.
Several nearby travelers openly stared while phones slowly started appearing in people's hands beneath the waiting area lights. But instead of approaching the old woman aggressively, the TSA officers looked toward Gloria first. And what happened next completely changed the atmosphere inside the terminal. The older TSA officer stepped beside the counter slowly, while keeping his eyes fixed on Gloria, rather than the elderly woman sitting quietly near the gate. "Can you explain exactly what the issue is?" he asked calmly. Gloria immediately pointed toward the boarding pass still resting beside the keyboard. "The booking triggered irregular activity in the system," she said confidently. "Possible fraud." The younger TSA officer picked up the boarding pass carefully and studied the information on the screen beside the counter. His expression changed almost instantly. He looked back at the monitor again, then at the elderly woman sitting alone beside her suitcase. The atmosphere around the gate shifted immediately. "Wait," he muttered softly. Gloria frowned. "What?" The younger officer lowered his voice slightly toward his partner. "This isn't fraud." Gloria's confident posture tightened. "Then why did the account trigger a flag?" The officer typed rapidly across the keyboard now, while nearby passengers leaned forward openly trying to hear the conversation. The older TSA agent slowly looked toward Gloria. "Who exactly authorized this passenger to be removed from boarding?" Gloria blinked. "Excuse me?" The younger officer turned the monitor slightly toward his partner. Both officers stared at the screen silently for several seconds. Then the older officer's face hardened immediately. "Oh no," he whispered under his breath. Nearby travelers immediately sensed the tension changing. The humiliation that moments earlier surrounded the elderly woman now started shifting slowly toward the airline employees themselves. Gloria looked visibly nervous for the first time. "What's happening?" she asked sharply. The older TSA officer slowly turned toward her. This passenger was not flagged for fraud. Silence spread instantly across the gate area. Several people visibly straightened in their seats after hearing that. Gloria's face tightened. Then why was the reservation locked? The younger TSA officer looked directly at her now. Because this booking was attached to an active federal monitoring case involving repeated discrimination complaints against airline staff. Complete silence. The words seemed to suck the noise directly out of the terminal. Nearby passengers stared openly now, while another airline employee beside Gloria slowly stepped backward. The elderly woman looked confused, still sitting quietly beside her suitcase, while everyone around her suddenly changed behavior completely. Gloria's face lost color immediately. "What?" she whispered. The older TSA officer slowly folded his arms.
This passenger was part of an internal investigation. And suddenly, panic started spreading across the gate. The gate area remained frozen in complete silence after the TSA officer spoke. Nearby passengers openly stared now, while whispers spread rapidly between rows of seats. Gloria stood behind the counter, completely motionless, her confident expression collapsing into visible fear. "Investigation," she whispered again. The younger TSA officer continued typing quickly into the terminal while shaking his head slightly. "This case has been active for months." Several nearby airline employees immediately exchanged nervous looks after hearing that. The older TSA agent slowly looked around the gate area crowded with passengers still watching everything unfold. There have been repeated complaints involving elderly and minority passengers being publicly delayed, separated, and humiliated at multiple gates. Gloria's breathing visibly changed now. "I didn't know anything about that," she said quickly. But even she sounded unsure of herself.
The younger officer finally looked up from the monitor.
"Your employee ID appears repeatedly in the complaint files." Gasps spread quietly through the waiting area. One woman near the charging station slowly lowered her phone, while another passenger muttered, "Oh my God," beneath his breath. Gloria immediately shook her head. "That's impossible." The older TSA officer looked directly at her. Passengers described the exact same behavior. His voice remained calm, almost emotionless. Public accusations, forced isolation near gates, escalation without evidence. Every word seemed to tighten the silence around the terminal even more. The elderly woman still sat quietly near her suitcase, looking overwhelmed, while passengers who earlier watched her with suspicion now stared at Gloria instead. The social pressure inside the terminal had completely reversed. One airline employee beside the counter slowly stepped farther away from Gloria, like she suddenly didn't want to be associated with her anymore. Meanwhile, several TSA agents had quietly started gathering farther down the terminal after hearing radio updates about the situation. The older officer finally looked toward the elderly woman sitting alone. His entire tone changed immediately. "Ma'am," he said softly, "I'm very sorry for what happened here." The elderly woman looked up slowly, still visibly shaken. "I didn't do anything wrong," she whispered quietly. The officer nodded once. "We know." And somehow those two simple words carried more emotional weight than anything else said that evening. The emotional atmosphere around Gate 32 changed completely now. Just 20 minutes earlier, passengers watched the elderly woman like she might be dangerous or dishonest. Now, those same travelers looked at her with sympathy, while openly staring at Gloria with growing disgust. The social power inside the terminal had shifted entirely. One older passenger finally stood from his seat near the boarding line.
"She kept humiliating that woman in front of everybody," he said loudly enough for nearby rows to hear.
Another traveler nodded immediately. "And nobody stopped it." The words spread through the gate area like pressure building inside a sealed room. Suddenly, more passengers started speaking quietly among themselves. "I saw her accuse the lady of fraud. She made her stand there for almost 30 minutes. Everyone was staring at her." The elderly woman lowered her eyes again, while tightly holding the boarding pass in both hands now. It was clear she wasn't enjoying the attention or the apology. She simply looked tired, emotionally exhausted. The younger TSA officer quietly approached her chair and gently crouched beside her suitcase. "Ma'am," he asked softly, "did anyone explain why you were being held?" The old woman slowly shook her head. "No." Her voice trembled slightly now. "I thought maybe I did something wrong." That sentence changed the atmosphere again, because suddenly the humiliation felt even heavier. She truly believed she deserved suspicion simply because authority treated her that way publicly. Nearby passengers visibly reacted emotionally after hearing it. One younger woman at the gate looked close to tears now, while another traveler quietly muttered, "This is awful." Gloria remained standing behind the counter, surrounded by silence and growing judgment from every direction. And for the first time that evening, nobody stood on her side anymore. Additional TSA supervisors soon arrived near the gate, while airline management hurried nervously through the terminal after hearing reports about the situation spreading among passengers. But the issue had already become bigger than one delayed boarding incident, because people were now asking uncomfortable questions openly.
How many other travelers experienced this before? How many elderly passengers were publicly embarrassed without anyone stopping it? How many people missed flights simply because employees decided they looked suspicious? The older TSA supervisor quietly reviewed complaint files on a tablet while standing near the gate counter. His expression grew darker with every page. "There are dozens of reports," he said quietly toward another officer. Nearby passengers overheard the sentence immediately. Gloria's face completely drained of color now. One airline manager finally arrived, breathless, beside the counter. "What's going on here?" The TSA supervisor looked directly at him. "Your gate staff appears connected to repeated discriminatory incidents involving elderly and minority passengers." Silence exploded across the area again. The manager looked horrified, while nearby airline employees lowered their eyes completely. The elderly woman still sat quietly beside her suitcase, watching the entire system around her suddenly panic after spending half an hour treating her like a criminal. One older traveler finally spoke loudly from the waiting area. "The saddest part," he said, "everybody watched this happen." Nobody answered him, because deep down, everyone knew he was right. Nearly an hour later, the atmosphere inside the terminal felt completely different from earlier that evening. Passengers who once avoided eye contact with the elderly woman now quietly approached her, offering apologies, water, and assistance, while airline supervisors moved nervously between TSA officers reviewing reports near the gate. Gloria had disappeared from the counter entirely after being escorted away for questioning by airline management. But the emotional weight of what happened still lingered heavily throughout the terminal. The elderly woman finally stood slowly near the boarding lane, holding her boarding pass again, while a TSA officer gently helped with her suitcase. Her hands still trembled slightly, not from fear anymore, from emotional exhaustion. The older TSA supervisor approached her quietly before boarding began. "Ma'am," he said softly, "because of your experience tonight, this investigation is likely going to expand nationally." The woman looked at him silently for several seconds, then quietly asked, "How many other people did this happen to?" The officer didn't answer immediately, and somehow that silence became the answer itself. Nearby passengers lowered their eyes while listening. The old woman slowly looked around the crowded gate one final time. "People kept staring at me like I was dangerous," she whispered softly. "And nobody asked if I was okay." Several travelers nearby looked visibly ashamed after hearing that. The elderly woman gently folded her boarding pass between her fingers before continuing. "That's the part that hurts most." Silence spread through the terminal again. Not awkward silence this time. Heavy silence. The kind that settles over people when they realize they witnessed something deeply wrong. As boarding finally began, passengers quietly stepped aside, allowing the elderly woman to walk onto the aircraft first. No applause, no dramatic speeches, just quiet respect, finally arriving far too late. And standing there beneath the bright terminal lights, watching her disappear down the jet bridge, many people inside Gate 32 understood the same painful truth. Sometimes, the most disturbing thing about public humiliation
isn't the cruelty itself. It's how many people choose to stay silent while it happens.